Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to Cybrary's live streaming of our CISM certification course. And CISM, of course, stands for Certified in Information Security Management. My name is Kelly Handerhan, and I'm going to be your instructor for the 4 modules of CISM, which is what we're going to be covering in this class. I've been around the IT field for over 20 years, really over 25 years, starting out back in the days when you could make a living as a hardware technician, moved over to networking, then network architecture, design, and cybersecurity for about the last, maybe 15 years, cybersecurity almost exclusively. So started out with Windows NT 351, Novell 3.1. I've been around for a minute to say the least. Now, the last 10 years, I have been focused on information security management, primarily in the cybersecurity field, leading projects, project manager, program manager. I am CISO of my own organization that I've created and founded for training and consultation. And I do have various certifications throughout the information security field. Most importantly and relevant to the class, I do have the CISM certification. It's always good when your instructor has the certification they're teaching. We like that. But I'm certified across some other things with cloud security and project management, and risk management also really helpful in life and in relation to the CISM exam. So I just tell you that so that you know I've been in the field for a while, I've been teaching for a while, and I have experience getting certified and helping other folks get certified, which is exactly what my goal is today. I want to give you the information that you'll need to take, to learn, to study, and so that you can be ready for the CISM certification exam. Now, this is not everything that you will need guaranteed 100% for you to pass the exam. It's going to be a great start. My job is to help you prioritize what to study, as well as to understand the concepts that you need in order to absorb the material. And then there will be some other tools that we have here at Cybrary that I'm going to be showing you in a bit so that you can get additional material and additional help with your studies. All right. But for now, I say let's go ahead and jump into our material. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is in this first section, we're going to just talk a little bit about the CISM exam, what the domains are, what the role of a CISM might be within an organization, and just the easy answers. They're usually, I would generally equate a CISO as somebody that has a CISM certification, and that's often the role that CISMs are looking to have. But like I said, as a project manager, program manager of information security projects or programs, this is going to be a really helpful certification for you to have. We'll talk a little bit about the exam and what to expect, and then we're going to move forward and start talking about the domains. Now, CISM comes from an organization called ISACA. So, it used to be about information assurance primarily, and auditing was originally ISACA's focus. It was Information Systems Audit and Control Association. That was the meaning for their acronym. But over the years, they've really expanded beyond audit and controls and have really branched out into the world of risk management. They've branched out into, of course, cybersecurity. And so they felt like that acronym was a little bit constraining. So ISACA is just ISACA today. They've kind of taken away the meaning for the acronym, and they're just affectionately known by so many of us as ISACA, knowing that they cover a broad range of information for cybersecurity. Excuse me, I got so choked up there. Just to talk to you for a minute about the CISM certification exam. This is a highly sought after certification exam. It has become in greater demand every year that I've been teaching it. The certification started back in 2003, really because of the fact that we needed some sort of criteria to assess whether or not someone has an understanding of information security, but bigger than that, do they have the capability of managing an information security program, an information security environment? So there is a small degree of technical knowledge that's sort of the groundwork, but the majority of this exam focuses on management skills, understanding framework, developing policy, developing an information security management system, which is basically just a very broad term for an environment that supports information security based on the organization's needs. So that's what the CISM certification exam is all about. If there are any of you that maybe don't have a background with it, like I said, this is becoming more and more popular, more and more sought after. So I think it's a great certification to get, and I've certainly benefited from having this certification. Now, before we start the class, I always like to go over prerequisites for the class. The big thing is you don't have to have any of these prerequisites for the class. You don't have to have job experience, you don't have to have network background, security background, but to take the exam, we'll talk about in a few minutes, there are requirements to hold the CISM certification. So if you're wondering, can I benefit from this course? I think people across the board, regardless of what your background, what your experience, what your career goals are, I think everybody can benefit from a course that looks at cybersecurity in context of the workplace and what the business needs are. But like I said, that doesn't mean everybody can get CISM certified. Now, this class will make the most sense to you if you have a background in networking or if you've gone through a class like a Net Plus or a Security Plus. Another certification that's just so perfectly aligned is the CRISC, Certified in Risk and Information Systems Computing. That is also by ISACA, and there is a ton of overlap between the CRISC certification and the CISM certification. So it's a very likely follow-up to this course, and we'll be offering it in the future as well. Also, if you've got some experience in information security management, obviously that's a big help as well. So, what prerequisites do you have to have? None. Can everybody benefit from this class? Absolutely. But there are things that'll make this course a little bit easier for you, and those are the prerequisites that we've listed. Now, what we're going to be covering is we are going to start off this course with the topic of information security governance. This is about 17% of the actual CISM exam. So the idea is we have to start with governance before we can get to management. And when we talk about governing entities of the organization, we're talking about our senior officers, our chief executive officer, our chief information officer. We're also, though, talking about the board of directors. We're also talking about, any steering committees often are up at that level as well. So they are the entities that set the tone, the direction, the organizational goals and objectives, and without those, we can't develop an efficient and effective security program. So we start, and what we'll be covering today is Domain 1, Information Security Governance. Now, tomorrow, we're going to move into talking about information security risk management. And risk management actually used to be 30% of the exam, and they've shrunk it a little bit, which is interesting to me. It's now 20% of the exam. So about a fifth of your exam is going to be on risk management. I really don't believe that that's any reason to doubt the significance of risk management in relation to cybersecurity. The two need to be integrated so that we can make good business decisions on the amount of security we need. And we'll spend a good amount of time talking about that. But when we talk about implementing security, we need to start with asking ourselves, what are we protecting? Okay, data. Okay, then what's it worth? We have a certain value, high, medium, low, or we may have a quantitative value that we can say, hey, what we're protecting is worth $18,000, whatever. All right. Now, once we know what we're protecting, what's it worth, then we have to look at the threats and vulnerabilities that exist. Okay. Threats and vulnerabilities give us a risk. Okay, then we want to figure out what the value of the risk is. What's our potential for loss? We take our potential for loss up against the cost of a countermeasure, and we make a good, cost effective decision on the right amount of security. That is risk management, and that is cybersecurity. So the two really are intrinsically linked. And the more we understand risk management, the better we're able to do our jobs in cybersecurity. So that's domain two. And even though you're not going to see as many questions on the exam as in the previous versions of the exam, it's still a very significant topic. In some ways, I think they kind of lessened the number of questions because they have the C-risk certification that's specifically focused on risk management. And I think maybe they didn't want too many overlap of ideas or questions, but please know risk management is a critical aspect of cybersecurity. We'll talk about that tomorrow. All right, now on day 3, we're going to cover our information security program, and that's a third of our tests. So, really important. The idea is senior leadership determines our strategy, our vision, our broad goals and objectives. But our information security program is how do we get there? Well, how do I accomplish the goals and objectives of the organization? Well, I have policies, I have procedures, I have standards, I have guidelines that I implement, I have security controls that I implement in order to protect my assets. There are a whole range of action items and documents to be produced that are part of the security program. So I kind of think this is the how to accomplish the what that governance says is important, right? Governance says this is what we want to do. Our information security program gives us the tools to actually do it and to get there. And then the last section is incident management. And again, interestingly enough, with this newer version of the CISM exam, they've kind of moved around priorities. This actually used to be less than 20%, and now it's 30%. The reason is they've expanded this to cover much more than just incident response, which is what it was in the beginning. Notice that it says incident management. So now we talk about planning, we talk about detecting incidents, and of course, response. And incident response can also include disaster recovery responses. It's much broader than it was in previous domains. So we'll wrap that up on Friday. And like I said, 30% of the exam. So this will give you a breakdown if you are thinking about taking the exam, where your priorities need to be with studying. Okay. We're going to cover one domain per day. And sometimes I get the question of how long will this take? As long as it takes. All right. So, if I had to give you my best guess, there's probably going to be 3 to 4 hours of lecture. We'll intersperse some breaks, including probably taking 20, 25 minutes just so that we can get a lunch break, depending on where you are located throughout the globe. That may be helpful to you. I'm located in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I get hangry if I do not get a lunch if I go too long without a lunch break. So we'll probably take little few breaks here and there. I try to take about a break an hour just so that everybody can get up, get the most important accessory to learning, which is a cup of coffee. So that's just kind of what you can expect from the class. This is something that is kind of a work in process, this live streaming. So bear with us if any sort of technical glitches come up. I think we should be fine. And also notice that you do have access to ask questions, and those questions will be passed along to me. So it may take a moment for me to see your questions. I'll wait for a logical pause to get to them. But just want to let you know, this is a real class with real material. This is the material that I use, the exact same material that I use to teach students CISM when I come out to an office or whatever. And I'll be conducting this class as normal. So this is a great benefit. This is really kind of cool. I was surprised that Cybrary was opening this up. It's just a free live stream. I think it's tremendous, and I want to encourage you guys to use it just like you would a typical class. So if you have questions, if you want your voices heard, jump out there. All right. Now, as I move along, I just wanted to kind of mention again how everything's connected, right? So when we start with information security governance and we write the policies, we understand the needs of our stakeholders, the priorities of the business. Well, where we go from there is going to be driven by risk management. What is our risk appetite? What tolerances do we have? How are we going to make good business decisions? Well, how much risk do we want to be exposed to? All right. Now, how much risk we're willing to be exposed to is going to dictate what our security program looks like. And again, our security program is the combination of controls and policies and procedures, how we organize our hierarchy within the organization. It's driven by risk management. And of course, an important part of our security program is we have to have a means to detect and respond to incidents. So they're all interrelated, as so much of the information technology world is. Just wanted to kind of show you that flow. The exam is going to be 4 hours, and there are 150 questions. All the questions are multiple choice. Each question is usually just 1 or 2 lines. You don't get these huge paragraph questions that you have to analyze what they're, trying to get at. Usually the questions are short and sweet. I don't think you're going to see scenario questions. Each question has one answer, either A or B or C or D. There is no choose all that apply or no, there are no uh, none of the above or both A and B. They're very straightforward. I have not had students run out of time. I've not had students tell me they've run out of time on this exam. I think 4 hours is plenty based on the format, especially if you take some of the principles we talk about in this course and apply them. You do your study, you go through, you take the tools that you have available to you, spend enough time getting ready. I, I think you should be good to go. Okay, so I'm going to do my best to point you in the right direction. I do also want to stress that once you pass the exam, you're not automatically certified as a CISM. And you cannot use the CISM designation, meaning you can't say, I've passed the CISM exam, right? That's not making you, or you can't say I'm a CISM because you passed the exam. You have to continue with the process, and the next process is you have to fill out an application. They'll remind you of that. You'll give them your email when you take the exam, and you'll get a message saying, "Congratulations, you passed. Now complete the app." Now, on the application, you have to designate that you have the documented relevant work experience. They will ask you for that relevant work experience on your application. The work experience used to be 4 years, or actually 5 years in two of the domains. That changes from time to time. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to go to isaca.org, and they will tell you specifically the requirements to, you'll see the CISM certification and information about that. Always go straight to the horse's mouth because ISACA changes the requirements from time to time. So I'm just going to tell you, if you want to find out, hey, do I have that work experience? Go to isaca.org and you can read through their most current list of requirements. Once you submit your application, there's a small fee in order to do so. They'll review your application, and then ideally you're certified. That certification is good for 3 years, or if you continue with your education and you attend a certain amount of training hours per year, then you can avoid having to retake the exam and you can continue with your certification as long as you're getting those continuing education units each year. Again, to find out how many of those CEUs, I'd like you to go to isaca.org because how you go about that, what constitutes a CEU, that can vary. All right, so ISACA.org is the ultimate authority for all the specifics regarding the exam itself. And if you're not sure about any of those and how to apply and all that good stuff, ISACA.org is where you go. All right, so just wanted to give you some preliminary information about the exam, what to expect. I know some of you are already planning on taking it, some of you are considering it. So I hope that just gives you kind of a little teaser about what to expect from the exam process. But I'm ready. Let's go ahead and start talking CISM stuff, right? Let's go ahead and jump into domain one. And domain one is information security governance. This is where it all starts. So let's just come back to governance itself, right? Let's just talk about generic term governance. And I promise you, I'm not going to read from slides. Cross my heart. But anytime we have something directly from ISACA that we see in quotes, I think it's important to look at as they've stated it, just so that we make sure that our minds are in alignment with ISACA. So just to hit a few high points here. So the first piece, governance ensures stakeholder needs, conditions, and options. So what do we do as a business? Well, it goes back to who our stakeholders are and what they need, any conditions that need to be satisfied, what their concerns and approaches are. And then notice, we don't have to satisfy every stakeholder need, but we do want to identify them and balance those stakeholder needs against things like, cost effectiveness, um, uh, uh, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Liabilities. Sorry. Let me just pause and get another coffee. Another sip of coffee. So we figure out who our stakeholders are and what they want. Then we have to balance them against other concerns like cost, like liability issues, so on, so that we can determine the objectives and goals of the organization that we're trying to achieve. Governance then is going to set the direction by prioritizing and decision making. So they're not the ones who are sitting there with pen and paper in hand, writing the policies, choosing the controls to protect assets, but they do prioritize, where do we direct our attention first? And they do make the decisions. They make sure that we're achieving our goals, right, as they've specified, against any sort of criteria that we've set. So the important thing is when we look to governance of the organization, they prioritize, they provide oversight to help us meet those goals and objectives and ensure that we continue to do so. Even though they may sign off on policies, they're not the ones writing policies generally. They may direct what the policy should contain, but they're not the ones going through the motions, doing the legwork. Okay, so if we take that idea and then apply it to information security governance, well, we know we're going to have a lot of overlap, right? So we know that with information security governance, we need oversight, we need prioritization, we need evaluation, all revolving around their information security assets. Now, notice when we're talking about our information security assets, we have to look at how we evaluate. If you'll remember a few minutes ago when I was talking about risk management, I said we have to start by looking at our assets and what they're worth. So we evaluate our assets, determine how to create, store, use, archive, delete. These pieces that you see, creation, storage, use, archival, and deletion, these are the phases of the data security lifecycle. So essentially, in information security governance, we are using the guidance of governance and applying it to our information, which is exactly what you would think about when you look at the term information security governance. But what we're doing here is we're using the goals of the organization to drive how we handle information throughout its life cycle, right? So how do we store data? We always will go back to the goals and objectives of the organization. Is our goal and objective of the organization to reduce cost to its absolute minimum value? Well, if all we're focused on is cost as an organization, that's very likely going to mean that we may cut some corners, right? But if the goals of the organization are to inspire customer confidence, well, then we're going to take a lot of time and emphasize transparency. We may choose to become certified based on various information security frameworks or whatever that may be. So the point is, governance comes first. What's the priority? What's important to the company? Information security governance, which is a subset, figures out how we protect information in a way that's in alignment with the organizational goals and objectives. I gotta tell you the truth. If I had a nickel for every time that idea comes up in ISACA material, I would have a lot of nickels. Okay. One of the most important things when you walk into this test is you want to remember that the role of information security governance is to satisfy the needs and objectives of the business. And that's not just a testable idea, that's the reality of what we do in information security. And I don't know about you, but I've heard people say you can never have too much security. And that's absolutely incorrect. And that's an idea and a concept you want to keep from, that's a rabbit hole you don't want to fall down. You can absolutely have too much security. When you have so much security that your organization can no longer function effectively or efficiently, that's too much security. If you think about it, how many of you have 15 deadbolts on your front door? Not me. I have one. I have a regular door lock and a deadbolt. Might I be more secure if I had 3 deadbolts or 5 or 10? Maybe. But here I am with 17 bags of groceries in my hand because I'm not making two trips out to the car, right? And I've got to put the bags down and unlock deadlock 1 and deadbolt 2 and deadbolt 3. That's too time consuming. That's not meeting my goal and objective of being efficient coming to and from my home. Because that's my goal and objective, I don't want 15 deadbolt locks. And by putting 15 deadbolt locks on my front door, I am taking away from the efficiency of meeting my goals. Right? And obviously, I'm being a little bit silly there, but the business has to do its business, right? And if we have so much security that users have to log in every time they access a file, or they have to answer a security challenge every 30 seconds, obviously they're not going to be able to perform their work. So what our job is also with information security governance is to figure out, and really it is to support the business in the way that meets their needs. What that means is the business is really my customer. And the customer mandates the degree of security that's necessary. Now, I can advise, I can instruct, I can conduct risk analysis and use that in order to help educate the business, the customer. But when it comes down to the decisions, that comes from the business units. That's another idea that's all over this test and really essential that we understand. The lines of business, these are the folks that own the data. The data owners determine the security. So if I recommend a security setting and the owner of the data disagrees, it's the owner of the data that gets to choose, not me. My job is to help them make good decisions, but when push comes to shove, that's what it comes down to. So this is a very specific mindset you want to walk into the CISM exam with, and you want to remember as you're working within information security. Understand the goals and objectives of the organization, figure out how to best support the organization, and work with the business owners to determine the right amount of security. Sometimes we in tech and we in security go in with a security solution in mind. We have to understand the business objectives before we can have any idea what the company needs, what the data needs as far as protection. Sometimes we get the cart before the horse, right? And that's why the data owners make the decisions. All right. Now, as we continue moving along, this first chapter, I got to tell you the truth, we have to kind of go through some foundational stuff to build upon. So I want you to bear with me because we're going to talk about governance and structure. We're going to talk about frameworks and some compliance ideas. So I want you to know that this is really relevant to us, even though it may not set your heart aflutter. And I realize that. But hang in there. This is a great certification. It's good information. We just have to lay the building blocks. Okay. So what I have here in front of us right now is a corporate governance structure. Now, for corporate governance, there is no one document that says every organization on the planet must be structured this way, right? That would be ridiculous. Every organization sort of has their own way of meeting objectives, their own organizational structure. What I have on the screen is just sort of a generic sort of suggestion as a general sort of default start for developing a corporate governance structure. The most important thing is that we have a structure, we have a hierarchy, we have a clear pathway for reporting, we have well-defined job descriptions, roles, and responsibilities. We make sure that we have separation of duties within this organizational structure. So I don't want you to feel like, oh, I got to memorize this. But just know this is just kind of a generic, typical one. But what you'll notice, shareholders at the very top, these are the folks that drive what we as an organization do, right? Ultimately, the shareholders. We have board of directors. We have a CEO that works with the board of directors, and answering directly to the CEO are the other senior managers. And then we have the individual committees, maybe steering committees, that individual units or business units report to, right? So our auditors would report to an audit committee that would report perhaps directly to the board. But notice that we have kind of that separation of duties, and we have a structure that would allow that reporting to happen without sort of conflict of interest or any sort of uh, difficulty or pull as far as priorities go. That's what's most important with our governance structure. So, of course, that's determined what the structure is by the shareholders, boards of directors, and the hierarchy does need to be well defined, again, with roles and responsibilities, which we'll look at in just a little bit. All right, so what's the responsibility of these boards of senior management? Do care, making sure that risks are adequately mitigated, allocating resources appropriately, meaning we don't just throw a whole bunch of money at security, we spend the appropriate amount looking for a positive return on investment. Our ultimate goal here is to make decisions based on risk awareness, to know when we have too many vulnerabilities, too much exposure, to know when maybe we're willing to undertake a little bit more risk for the possibility of gaining more. Sometimes we call that a risk utility, what we stand to gain from taking a risk. So again, oversight. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about due care as well as due diligence in just a moment. All right. Some of the typical roles and their responsibilities could come up. Now, again, it's not 100% written in stone, but for instance, companies have CEOs. That's generally their highest ranking officer, right? That's, kind of how we define a CEO. And this is the person that has the ultimate authority to make decisions for the organization. Often, when we talk about liability often goes all the way up to the CEO, depending on what the issue is. So, for instance, if we have an organization that has a major security breach, a lot of times maybe the security officer, but then depending on the scope of the breach and the organizational structure, it may be the CEO also that's held liable. For CEO would certainly be held liable for loss of company assets, for failing to protect resources appropriately. So they're the chief decision maker. And then from the CEO, we'll look at some of the other senior officers. First of all, the COO, Chief Operations Officer. Now, the operational functions of the business. So this is usually the person just a step down from the CEO. They're in charge with the business, meeting the business goals. And actually, even before that, determining what the business goals are and ensuring that the processes and procedures are in place to make sure we're capable of meeting those goals. So when you think about the COO, their ultimate goal is meeting the goals, implementing a program so that we can meet the goals of the organization. That's a really important role, of course. But the reason I point that out is the ultimate owner of the data of the organization, or I won't say ultimate owner, let's say the decider. When it comes to risk management of information data, of protection of resources, the ultimate decider is the chief operating officer and the operations team. So just a minute ago, I said in security, we don't get to determine how everything should be secured. It's the data owners, the lines of business, starting with the the COO all the way down. I hope I'm making sense. Maybe I need to have more a larger cup of coffee. But if I'm not making sense, make sure you're asking your questions in chat. So if I go through something too quickly, just let me know. Hey, can you repeat that, or say it again? But the COO ultimately is going to be the entity that's going to determine what amount of security is enough for the resources of the organization. Okay, not the security team. We serve operations, and the head of operations is the COO. So you could even see a question like, who would be the best officer to oversee the security program? And a lot of people choose the CIO, Chief Information Officer. Sometimes people choose Chief Security Officer. But reality, when we talk about sponsoring the information security program or having sign off on it, that comes from the business. So it's not unusual at all to see the COO sponsor the security program because they're the ones that have to look at the value of what's being protected versus the risks and make a good business decision. Okay, so a really important role for us in information security, making sure that we work with the chief operating officer to make sure that we understand what the allowable trade-offs for security are. Now, other officers, I'm kind of surprised I didn't put CFO on here because your chief financial officer is really important. And you say, but Kelly, why would the chief financial officer be important in relation to security? You're probably not asking me, right? They're the ones that sign the checks. So, chief executive officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, these folks have to be on board and have to understand the security function and the needs for security. Now, Chief Risk Officer, of course, and it would kind of be assumed that that's a given, but the Chief Risk Officer looks at all risk and may be focused on business type risks as opposed to information security risks. So they're part of the picture, okay? But it doesn't mean that they are knowledgeable in relation to specific information security risks or IT risks. Same idea with Chief Security Officer. They're going to be looking at things like facility security and other types of security. So we're all, the idea is everybody has a role to play in information security. That doesn't mean all your executives are specifically involved in the day-to-day, and it also doesn't mean that they have buy-in by default. All right, Chief Information Officer, ultimately responsible for the management, implementation, and usability of information and computer-based technologies. So the CIO has a lot on their plate. Do we have the right technology? How do we acquire that technology? We have to look at it from a cost benefit standpoint. We have to make sure information security risks are appropriately managed. We have to ensure that we have the proper policies in place, and on and on and on. Usually, we also have a CISO. It used to be that the CISO would report to the CIO. We've really gotten away from that because we want that CISO ideally to work directly with the board of directors or even the CEO to make sure that we approach security from its own unique perspective, to make sure that the information security officer doesn't report to the information officer, because that information security officer may have um, may need the direct ear of the CEO or of a steering committee. They are specifically focused on CIA. So CIA triad, any of you that have been around information security know confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when we think about information security, that's what we focus on. Confidentiality. I need to keep my secrets secret. I need to make sure we prevent against unauthorized disclosure. Integrity means I need to be able to detect unauthorized modification of data. I need to know that the data is reliable and hasn't been changed. Okay? And then availability, of course, I need timely access to the data. So I need to be able to access the data when I need it. It needs to be available in a timely manner. All right. So those are our senior officers, senior leadership. So when I talk about senior managers, those are the folks I mean. Um, but we also then come down to functional management. And when we say functional management, we're looking more at department heads. So there would also be a manager in relation to information security, and they would report to the CISO. Whereas governance figures out what we need to do, management figures out how. So these are the folks that really get to the nitty gritty. It's great to say we need 99.9997% uptime, and that would come from the CISO in relation to availability. Now the information security manager has to come in and say, okay, so we're going to need a 7-node cluster. It needs to be geographically distributed. Here are the services that will exist on the cluster, right? So figuring out how to accomplish the goals set by the CISO come to the information security manager. Again, for those of you testing, think of yourself as a CISO. Okay, you are not the boots on the ground person. You're not one to fix. You're not one, like, for instance, if you were to see a question like you have an employee that's scheduled to be terminated at 3 p.m. At 10 a.m. on Friday. What should you do? Well, you are a CISM, a CISO, or at the very least, a generic sort of information security manager. Your job is to make sure policies and procedures are in place. But as far as having a manager or CISO come down to the basement and disable an account, because I'll guarantee you, most people, when I say, hey, you've got an employee that's going to be terminated, what do? Most people will say, well, disable their accounts, revoke their credentials, get company property back. But that's not our job. So on the exam, what is your job in relation to that, instance? Call the appropriate parties, review policy, make sure that we have processes in place to handle the termination. Okay? So again, our priorities on this exam, we are not doers. We are not fixers. We make sure that the appropriate parties have the right policies and procedures to follow. We make sure that they're trained. We make sure that they're supported. And ultimately, we evaluate whether or not the security program, these policies and processes, are in fact successful if they provide us with what we need. Now, a couple of other roles that we want to address, and I've already mentioned the data owner. The data owner, when you hear that phrase, think operations, think the lines of business. So the sales line of business owns sales data. Okay. When we talk about, production data, it's owned by the production team. So they are the data owners. They are the ones generally that create the data, that use the data, and they are the deciders. Always, the data owners are the deciders. So if there's a conflict between security I want to implement and what they want implemented, they win. And the reason for that is very important, is that they're focused on meeting the goals of the business. And it's their job to understand how much security to implement while not negatively impacting too greatly the goals of the business. Security always costs something. Ain't nothing free, right? We're always going to have to pay for security. Maybe with performance, maybe with ease of use or user acceptance, maybe backwards compatibility, but whatever it is, we'll have to pay for security. So the data owner determines how much they're willing to give up to have secure assets. And their decisions must be made, in theory, would be made with the ultimate goal of meeting business objectives. So it's their job to determine how much security is enough. So obviously, our risk management philosophy, appetite, approach, framework needs to be integrated throughout the organization so that our data owners are able to make good risk-aware business decisions. But again, the data owners are the deciders. Now, the data custodians are the ones that maintain the data. Day to day, who backs up data? The custodians. Who recovers? Who implements the security controls? Usually it's the tech team. These are the folks that are the custodians, right? So your admins, your technicians, your fixers of problems, those are the custodians. And then ultimately, we look to bring all of these roles together so that we work towards, first of all, so that we understand and then work towards the goals of the business. All right. That's a good spot to pause. And I am going to pause from time to time and check in with you all and see if you have any questions. But don't feel like you have to wait for me to pause. If you've got a question or a thought, just jump right in. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts or anything you want clarified based on what we've covered so far? Okay, if there are no questions, and if your question hasn't made it to my screen yet, that'll happen in just a moment or two. But what I'd like to do now is I'd like us to just take a couple of, just a short few minutes break, give us a chance to stand up, refill our coffee, and do those things that we need to do. And we'll be trying to take a short break about every hour. So let's do this. It is what is it? It is 11:56. Why don't we please return at 12:05? And that way we can have our break and pick back up. Okay. So please return at 12:05 and we will continue. All right. Everybody have a good break. Hey, welcome back from break. I just wanted to cover a couple of questions that popped up in our chat over break. So let's see. The first question I had was from Samir. If there is any time in the training where we will get some real multiple choice questions like the exam. Yeah, I'll try to be kind of interspersing them throughout my lesson. And then at the end of the day, we'll go over just a handful of questions to kind of see the approach. But one of the things that we're doing it at Cybrary, which again I think is really cool. So we're offering these live streams now, for those folks that want to take use of additional Cybrary services, which we have a lot of, but primarily the things that would be most helpful to you would be that we work with Cyber Vista, the organization Kaplan, and I don't know if any of you have been around long enough to remember the company Transcender, but at any rate, we're working with these other organizations and have created an exam question database. I'll show you those in just a little while. I need to pull those together, but we do at Cybrary offer with many of our classes labs. There's not really a lab for CISM because that doesn't lend itself, but we do have additional exam questions that would help you get prepared for the exam. But during training, I'll throw some questions out, and at the end of the day, we'll review. I also want to congratulate Arthur, who just recently passed his CISSP because he is a rock star. Congratulations, Arthur. And Chad, I appreciate your comment as well. And then we had a question from Ned, who is studying for the CISSP using the course on Cybrary. Great. So glad to hear that. And Ned wanted me to kind of parse out the differences between who would take CISM and who would take CISSP. There is overlap, of course, on the exam, particularly the sections on risk management, on information security governance, absolutely. But primarily, I would look at CISSP as folks that are more interested in staying technical, whereas CISM for folks that want to move up into management. For me, I stayed in technical for a long time, but once I started moving towards management, program management, once I set my sights on various executive roles, I decided to get the CISM certification, the project management certification, the PMP, and C-risk. I felt like those were both really important with the focus on moving up into executive management and leadership. So that's how I would kind of look at the differences. But I'll tell you, CISSP is not as technical as it used to be. A lot of this that we're talking about here, about focusing and understanding the needs of the business before we make security decisions, there's a lot of that on the CISP exam as well. All right, and those are the questions I have in front of me. And like I said, in just a little bit, I'll give you a sample of some of the questions that Cybrary offers to help you get ready for your exam. And depending on your course, like CISSP, we also have a lot of really good labs out there that'll help you as well. All right, but back to business. And our business is talking about information security governance. And we said this really lays the groundwork for our information security program, which we'll look at on day 3, which will be Thursday. So, governance, ultimately, what does governance provide an organization? Well, there's some principles that our governing entity should adhere to. Now, these come from um, an organization called Open Ethics and Compliance Group, OECG. I had to think about that acronym for a minute. And ultimately, the principles of sound corporate governance. Our governing entities should be fair. That sounds reasonable to me, meaning they act without partiality or prejudice. They make good business decisions based on business requirements without acting upon bias. Now, for those of you that'll be back for the C-risk certification course, we'll talk about some of the ways that we do act with bias, a lot of times unintentionally. and that can impact the governing and the management decisions that we make. So we want to act without that bias. Accountability. We need to be held to a set of standards to fulfill responsibilities regardless of our roles within the organization. So our governing entities too. And in many ways that comes through legal requirements and legal liabilities, right? And that we have to adhere to regulations and laws and requirements from our stake and stockholders. Transparency. Now, with transparency, we want what we do to be out in the open without hiding. We want to make sure that we're able to provide accounting for our processes, our procedures. We want to be sure that we are able to be audited, that we have that capability to display our approaches to risk management, to information security as necessary. And then, of course, responsibility that we do our best to serve our stakeholders and our stockholders. Okay. This is not the type of exam that's going to say, what are the 4 principles of corporate governance? So this isn't something that I want you to memorize and generally when there's something, hey, you got to memorize this. So much of chapter 1 is understanding the concepts and the foundations. Now you're going to get about 30 questions on corporate governance. So they'll give you sort of, a couple of sentences and they might say, you're leading a project and have to choose a developer. Developer A is a senior developer who performs very quickly but is a difficult employee. Developer B is slower but generally um, gets along with everybody in the team. Which developer do you choose? So the idea is that we act without partiality or prejudice. And they'll probably word it a little bit better. They'll probably say something like developer A doesn't like you and you frequently conflict with them. So the idea is we choose the developer that does the best work because that's acting without partiality or prejudice. Just because a developer doesn't like to work with me doesn't mean that I don't choose them if they do the best work. Again, I'm just kind of pulling this off the top of my head, so don't nitpick that question too much, but that's how you could see these questions. So I'm ethically required to act without bias, to choose the team member that performs the best work, whether they like me or not. I mean, dear Lord, if I could never work with somebody that didn't like me, I would be sitting at home in my basement right now. Actually, I'm sitting at home in my basement right now, so maybe that's not a good sign. But the bottom line is we act with fairness. So they're not going to say, hey, fairness, accountability, transparency, responsibility, expecting you to memorize them, but they may expect you to demonstrate these in decisions that you make. Okay? Now, the benefits of information security governance. Well, we could really talk about that all day. Why do we need governance? Well, you have to have oversight, right? You have to have ultimate accountability. There has to ultimately be someone that has that skin in the game to ensure that we protect our assets as necessary. And as necessary means we don't want to be held liable. We don't want to be sued. Certainly don't want to go to jail, but we also don't want loss. Now, every organization is susceptible to loss. How much loss will we tolerate? Well, we have to have governance to make those decisions. We have to have someone to define what the goals and objectives are of our information security program. The goals, the objectives are determined by IS governance. What the program is and how it's going to accomplish those goals comes from the program. So again, this is really just an extension of what we've been talking about. I cannot stress though, again to you for the exam, so much of this, I saw a lot of repetition on my exam. I saw a lot of questions that at the end of the day led to understand the goals and objectives of the business first. Figure out how information security fits into the business. Governance leads. Management, leads, points the direction, sets the goals. Management figures out the how. Again, just these questions over and over. And I think that it's also really significant to understand that passing this exam, for those of you that are studying for it, is much more of a philosophy, um, an understanding than it is about memorizing a bunch of facts. I don't know if any of you've taken like a Security Plus exam where you have to just memorize a whole bunch of stuff, port numbers and firewall rules and this, that, and the other. This is an exam that really is going to test your ability to make good business decisions based on the information in the question, how you can choose information security solutions to meet the goals of the business. And you'll get tired of me saying that, I'm sorry, but it's so important, and that's what this class and this exam focuses on. All right, so I think we're good here. Well, I think we get the role of governance. But these questions, am I doing the right thing? Okay, so the stakeholders have told me what their goals are. Am I satisfying those goals? Am I balancing, prioritizing those goals? Are we doing them the right way? Sometimes there are multiple ways to get from point A to B, right? Am I doing it the right way and getting them done well? Am I choosing the most efficient, effective approach? And are we realizing benefits? Because if we're not realizing benefits, then maybe we aren't doing the right things or we aren't prioritizing correctly. So if the answer to any of these questions is no, we need to figure out how to change the no's to yeses. Okay? Let's see, question here. Amanda, hi, good question. When did I take the exam last time? I took it in June of let's see, was it June? Maybe in August, but I took it very shortly after the new exam objectives were out. Honestly, I didn't see a huge shift in the nature of the questions. I felt like there was a shift in number of questions. I definitely saw more questions about business continuity, incident detection, incident response, management, a couple of very high level forensics questions, just like how do you prioritize what would be access first, just very high level stuff. So I saw some differences in number of questions for each of the domains, but honestly, if it weren't for that, to me, I felt like it could very easily have been the same exam I took when I first took it 12 years ago. So I have taken it currently. So everything that I share with you is from my experience as well as other students that have taken this as well. Okay, now we've said that governance sets the goals and objectives. Then the question is, well, how do we meet those goals and objectives? And like we said, governance isn't going to go through and write every policy, procedure, standard, guideline. Governance isn't going to choose what the control is. But what governance is going to have a hand in deciding, and specifically, they're generally going to choose what framework we adhere to as an organization. So, for instance, we may find that our goal and objective is to increase customer confidence, right? That's determined by governance, that we want to increase maybe our trustworthiness within the industry, customer confidence, brand recognition, those sort of objectives. Well, one of the things that we may choose to do in order to accomplish increasing customer confidence would be to become certified as an organization. Just like you as individuals are looking to get certified as individuals, as individual workers, so that you can, kind of prove your reliability and your knowledge. Organizations may get certified based on certain frameworks, or they may just use the frameworks as guidance. But ultimately, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We want to increase confidence, so providing, having a proven, tried and true method of approaching an information security management program may be the way to go. And there are a lot of frameworks that are out there. Once again, not something hugely testable. So you don't need to be scratching out every element of COBIT or, every single piece of ISO 27001 or 27002. But first of all, you want to be aware of what a framework is and how it helps us. So a framework ultimately cannot be determined until you know what your objectives are. Some are information security frameworks, some are business frameworks. Of course, we're going to focus on information security. Some are quality frameworks. So, what is it within your organization which framework is going to match your business objectives? Governance determines that first. And then the framework is going to set up the structure for your security program. So we know what our goals are. We're going to choose a framework that aligns with those business goals, and then it's going to provide us the structure. So, how do we support access control? How do we support risk management in our company? How do we support physical security? Not the details of specifically what our policy should say, but the guidance of what an information security policy should address. The guidance of what we need to be concerned with access control to resources, with physical security, whatever those may be. Okay, so ultimately, a framework is sort of setting those individual elements that we need to accomplish, and then our security program will satisfy the framework. I hope this is starting to kind of flow. All right, now if we look at some of the various frameworks that are out there, again, we're really going to focus on the cybersecurity frameworks primarily, but think of support and structure. And let's look at what we want to see here. Oops. All right. So the first to look at is COBIT. Now, COBIT stands for Control Objectives for IT. Now, with control objectives for IT, that kind of tells us in the name what it does. And the idea is essentially that we start with the business processes and the business goals. And for every business goal and objective, you should be able to break it down, break it down, break it down, all the way to the point where you can see what information technology controls meet those business objectives. In the same way, you should look at any IT control and be able to trace it back up to a business objective. And the idea, of course, there's no such thing in our company of security for the sake of security. Security is to meet the business goals. So business goals can be traced down to security controls in IT, but also IT goals can be IT controls are traced back up to the business as a whole. Now, COBIT is a massive framework. There are a whole lot of elements to it. It's not just a quick list of, here's a control that meets an objective. So in this framework, they start out by defining the principles of governance. Now, again, I don't think they're going to give you a list and say, out of this list, which is a principle of COBIT's governance structure. But I think it's interesting to look at COBIT, knowing that COBIT comes from ISACA, and to, kind of look at this as a way of ISACA saying, this is what governance needs to do, and this is how governance should work within the organization. Less memorization and more understanding the concepts. Okay? All right. The number one principle is to provide stakeholder value. You really could say every organization is in business to provide stakeholder value. Now, every organization has different stakeholders and different understandings of what the word value means, right? But that's why we're in business. That's why we're doing what we do, is somehow, some way, we provide value to our stakeholders. So everything that's true for the business should be true for information security. Do we in information security provide value? Well, we don't profit the company, right? I mean, there are very few things I do in information security that creates profit for the company, but I do a whole lot in the organization to reduce loss. That's still value. So in information security, not only do I have to provide that value, I have to be able to demonstrate that to prove the value that I provide. And a lot of times in information security, we don't do a great job of demonstrating our value, right? You know, I could see questions coming up on the exam that, you've made your pitch to senior leadership and they are still unwilling to release funds to support one of your information security endeavors. What could you do to change their mind? Show value. Don't go into the office of the CEO or even, your chief information officer, your chief risk officer, your other officers. Don't go in spouting jargon and acronyms. We go in talking about value. We look at the value of what we're protecting. We look at threats and vulnerabilities. We determine the potential for loss. We look at how countermeasures can limit or lessen that potential for loss. And can they do so in a means that reduces loss that gains value for the organization? That's another thing that comes up over and over. Cost benefit analysis, return on investment, getting out of the basement and that mentality and talking about how IT delivers value to the organization and IS. Okay, I'm not going to read all of these. I think most of these make sense. I do just want to point out this idea of a holistic approach to the organization. That's also big on the exam and an important idea for us as well as the business. I mean, I realize we're part of the business, and that really, I almost misspoke there. Let me try that again. I'm going to just rewind. Zip. Holistic approach is important that all of us within the organization understand we're part of one body. So it's no longer the IT folks in the basement doing IT stuff, writing code and whatever it is the IT people do, and the rest of the business trying to get our jobs done, right? IT is part of the business. Information security is part of the business. So information security is part of business decisions. It's the difference between having security on the menu and security being seated at the table. And that's a very big difference. So we don't want the information security team to be adhering to one framework while the organization as a whole is on a totally different framework. We don't want a risk management methodology for the company um, in one way and the information security team following a different risk methodology. We want the organization be treated as a whole. We want alignment throughout the organizations with our strategies, our frameworks, and our methodologies as much as possible. So no longer these separate entities of the business and then IT. IT is part of the business, and the more we integrate business-based decisions with IT, vice versa, the more complete our solution will be. All right, so those are just some principles. Most of those will make sense. I would know what COBIT is. I would focus on the mapping of organizational objectives to IT controls. And by the way, when I use that term IT controls, what are those security elements that we implement? Encryption, access control, physical security, risk management policy. Those are the controls that we implement. So alignment of our controls to business objectives. It's a big focus of COBIT. Now, one of the ways that COBIT gives us one of the directives, if you will, that it provides us is to look at the organizational goals in sort of a cascading function. So we have to start with our stakeholder needs. what their objectives and needs are. That then becomes mapped to enterprise goals. And those goals then become aligned to objectives. Objectives are how we reach our goals. And then those governance objectives are then cascaded down. I actually need another little block here to show the cascade down to IT goals and objectives. So it's just exactly like what we've talked about is we start out very broad and ultimately everything we learn from our stakeholders' needs, the prioritization allows us to determine the enterprise goals, which align with objectives, which align with the IT controls. Okay, now this next piece, not testable at all. I just went a little further into COBIT just in case, somebody wanted more of a mental reference for it. But ultimately, what the COBIT framework looks like is they've essentially spelled out 5 domains, and you see these domains over here in the bullet points. And then their framework essentially says, okay, across these domains, what are the main elements that need to accomplish or that exist here? So for instance, if you look at EDM, evaluate, direct, and monitor, that's usually specifically governance. So they set the framework, they make sure we're getting benefits and that risks are optimized. Then that comes down, oops, let me jump back over here. Then that comes down to align, plan, and organize. So this is what we're trying to accomplish in align, plan, and organize. So what you can see is at each of these domains, there are a set of responsibilities. Now notice, they don't tell you exactly what you need to know to set up your enterprise architecture. That's not the job of a framework. The job of a framework is to say, you need these elements. You need a strategy that's managed. You need enterprise architecture. You need innovation and developing your portfolio. Now, it'll give you some guidelines for what an enterprise architecture is or what a portfolio would contain, but it's not going to fill in the details. The details come from your program. Remember, your framework's broad structure for what you need to accomplish. Your information security program will tell you how to get there. All right, now the next. If any of these frameworks were testable, it would be ISO 27001 and 2. Now, ISO stands for the International Organization of Standards. And I know it's ISO, but ultimately that's just collectively what they're known as. It's the International Organization of Standards. And their job is, or let me say it this way. The international organization focuses on standardization, of course, hence the name, because when we have standards, we have compatibility, we have environments that work together as opposed to proprietary mechanisms that can make configuration and management difficult. They have a set of standards in the 27000 series that are focused towards cybersecurity. Now, what we'll look at specifically are the standards from 27001 through 27005. That's what we're going to look at right now. There are other ISO standards that will come up later in the course, but these are the ones just to look at right now, primarily focusing on ISO 27001 and 2. So you can see, just like what we're talking about, is when we understand the risks of our organization, that will help us determine what controls get implemented. Okay, so when we talk about safeguards or countermeasures, those are controls. So what ISO 27001 does, and by the way, this is the most common framework for information security. I think that could be a question. What's the most common framework for information security? Well, It makes sense that it's ISO 27001 because it's an international standard. So the framework for ISO 27001 uses what's called the PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And the PDCA essentially says when you're working with an information security program or information security management system, that's really a better term. And that's the term that you'll associate with ISO 27001. When you're working with an information security management system, you start by planning. Start with your objectives. Figure out how to best meet your objectives. Do says, well, implement them. Then check. You need to check and determine if what you've done has worked, and if not, you act upon it. And that process is ongoing. You're always planning, doing, checking, and acting to make sure that you're current, you're up to date, and you're adequately managing risks. Because when it comes right down to it, cybersecurity is risk management. I mean, it is, right? Am I managing my cybersecurity risks adequately? Now, this is set up so that you have 11 clauses, all right? Then the second piece is going to provide the controls. So if you look at the requirements, here are a portion of the requirements. What do you have to do? Well, you start off with figuring out the contents, text of the organization, and then leadership, and then you get into supporting and operations and so on. Right? You have these pieces that the framework has to support, that has to define for you. But ultimately, once you have these defined, you have to have individual controls to enforce. So we may prioritize data and we may have a classification scheme and we may determine that certain data needs to be protected a certain way, but that's all very broad. Once again, we need specific controls to define how. So for instance, if I look in ISO's 27001 framework, there will be a control that specifies security policies and how I need to format, what information I need to communicate, my policies, how I organize, HR, personnel security, asset management. And I've got all the control families. There are 14 control families that are there. And starting with A5 through A18. Don't memorize, don't memorize, don't memorize. What I need you to memorize or to understand, the most common information security framework out there is ISO 27001. It provides structure and guidance for an information security management system. I don't even need you to know there are 11 clauses or 14 control families. I need you to know that it provides guidance for the entire life cycle of an information security management system. It uses the Plan, Do, Check, Act. It puts the responsibility of risk management on senior leadership. It is also a framework to which I would certify. So if my organizational objective is to improve customer confidence, one of the ways we improve confidence in our customers is we get certified. We have a third party certify us and say, yes, they are reliable in these elements. So my business may get ISO 27001 certified. I would be certified to ISO 27001. Now, the controls. The controls are the second part. They are referenced just in the appendix of ISO 27001. They are further defined in a document called ISO 27002. Now, this is one of those things they love to ask about on tests because at first it can be hard to figure out, well, what's one and what's two? Here's the deal. The framework is an O1, the structure. the broad definitions, goals. The details of how are in 27002. The controls that are listed over here in the appendix of ISO 27001 are further broken out and defined in much more detail in 27002. So here's the way to think of it. If the question asks you what framework, the answer is going to be 27001. If they ask you about security controls, it's going to be ISO 27002. Okay? It's just from a test perspective. If you're not testing, these are documents that are worth delving into if your organization is looking to determine more of a formalized structure for protecting information security or for providing information security, right? I need maybe to take advantage of the work that's been done by others and figure out, well, what are the goals or what are the elements of an information security policy or personnel policy or this, that, or the other. So the framework and the controls, you could say that ISO 27002 help you determine the controls necessary to be certified via ISO 27001. That's really kind of how they work together. Now, when it comes to actually implementing the controls, that's in another document called ISO 27003. And then 27004 gives you guidance on penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, ensuring the controls operate appropriately and effectively. And then ISO 27005 is about risk management. We look at that in more depth in the C-risk class. So bottom line, we're going to continue after our break in looking at some of these frameworks. Memorization isn't as important as understanding the concepts and the purpose. You can always go download ISO 27001. Now they charge for it, but you can do that to get the details. On CISM, they may just say, what would be a certification your organization might obtain to inspire confidence in its processes revolving around an information security management system. So when you hear that ISMS and when you hear framework, ISO 27001, you need guidance on controls that would help you satisfy that framework, ISO 27002. So don't get caught in the weeds on this exam. This is not an exam. There are things to memorize, but that's not really the type of exam this is. It's much more conceptual. It's much more understanding where you would go to find out what you're looking for. So I don't need to know all the details of 27001. I need to know why I would use it. So kind of think about it from that perspective. Okay. How are we doing as far as the material? Everybody still awake? Still hanging in there? Just kind of wanted to see if anybody has any questions or thoughts, any comments, anything you want to throw out there. And remember, today is a little bit slow because you have to set the baseline. You have to do the foundational work. I promise you that once we're done with the frameworks and information governance, tomorrow's really cool because we talk about risk management. Then Thursday's awesome because we build our information security program. And then Friday's great because we look at incident response and management and continuity and all this good stuff. Today, quite honestly, is a little slow, but we're getting there and we're building and we're moving towards where we need to be. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take our hourly break. I'm going to have us come back at 12:55. So please come back at 12:55 and we are going to pick up and continue. And yeah, go have a good break, grab some coffee and come on back. See you in just a few. All right. Welcome, welcome, welcome back. We had been talking about information security governance, and I had a question earlier about whether or not this training is going to include some multiple choice questions or, some test prep more geared towards, like practice test or whatever for the exam. Sorry, let me get back to where my slides were. And I wanted to show you, I'm going to just share my screen for a minute and let's see here. And what I want to show you is I want to show you what you would get as part of Cybrary's Insider Pro. So bear with me just a minute. So what you'll get if you become a member of Cybrary, in addition to access to all the courses that we offer, you're also going to get some access to additional learning content. Now, if I go back to the screen, um, CISM specifically is going to offer flashcards and an exam simulation, basically test prep, review questions, simulate the exam environment. Other courses like CISP or Net Plus, A Plus, Sec Plus, ethical hacking, all those will also include labs, so some real hands-on meeting the objectives using simulation software. So I'll just show you with one of the things that I like about this is if I go in and set up a custom quiz, notice that we have the 4 domains. And so I can choose, okay, I just want to see information security program. Or I can go in and say, you know what, let me make sure I understand how to establish and maintain the program, or make sure that I understand how to integrate requirements into organizational processes. So you get a lot of power in order to customize the exam, and there are a total of 191 questions for CISM itself. Again, each of the courses would also include exam prep. Many of them include labs as well. So this particular live stream event doesn't, come with test prep software, whatever, but that would be, of course, available as an Insider Pro with Cybrary. Would also mention, without going into too much, that let's see if I am where I need to be. Yeah. So when you sign up and let's say you go and look at what's available from CISM, so you can start off with doing a pretest. You've got the course itself, which I happen to teach the CISM course, and then practice exam, how to go about it, scheduling the exam, as well as additional courses that might be helpful for you. Okay, so that's as close to a commercial as you're going to get from me. And I'll tell you the truth, I'm a huge fan of Cybrary. I've been working with Cybrary since they originally came out and began as an organization. So I'm a big fan. I love the fact that we offer so many resources. So Cybrary Insider Pro is going to extend beyond just what we have here. All right. Did anybody have any other questions you didn't get a chance to ask? And again, I'm just going to remind you, pop those in chat when they come up, and I will get to them as soon as I can. But you guys have asked some great questions. Don't be shy. That's what I'm here for. Anything I can do to help. All right, so we're kind of on the downside or the backside. We don't want to say downside, but we're on the last leg of the tour, if you will. And so we're going to continue marching forward with our frameworks. The next framework to look at is GDPR. Now, the General Data Protection Regulation is what GDPR stands for. And this is really important because of the fact that many countries have accepted and implemented GDPR into their national framework, into their national laws and regulations in relation to privacy. We here in the US do not have federal privacy laws. Now, we have particular laws and regulations or regulations geared towards specific industries. But as far as a national perspective on, or directive rather, on protecting privacy of information, we don't have one. So I think fair game for a question might be something to the effect of the US, Canada, and the European Union have decided to enter into an agreement defining particular regulations related to data privacy. Which country would have the hardest time adhering to this treaty? And it would be the US because we don't already have federal privacy guidelines. So GDPR is what the European Union has accepted, and many companies within the US adhere to the GDPR standards because they do business in the European Union. And it's important to look at this from the perspective or from the point that GDPR gives the data subject many more rights than we do here in the States. In the States, we tend, in relation to business, to sort of favor the businesses more so than the individuals about whom the data describes. So in the European Union, the data subject has a lot of rights. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, they have the rights to transparency. They have the right to know exactly what is being collected about them and when. They have the right to access the information that's collected about them and to request that information to be rectified or erased. So we can choose, I want that information erased and removed from the database. They have the rights to have automated decision making. So, if you look at this, that's defined as the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling. That's an important element because so much of what happens is just based on automation. It's automatically going to trace this information or track this information about a data subject. So as a data subject, we have a lot more control under the regulations of GDPR. As a matter of fact, if you want more information on all the things, all the rights of data subjects, over on the right side in this black rectangle, a little bit more information, and there are more rights than are just in the bottom left. The fines are increased. There is a lower time or shorter time that when an incident is detected, as to when authorities have to be notified. It's now under GDPR, they have 72 hours to notify the appropriate parties. There is a lot of information that's specifically documented to be considered to fall under GDPR. This is just a good kind of cheat sheet that hits at the gist of what the General Data Protection Regulation sets forth and the responsibilities of the various elements. Who are the data players, who's the data controller or the processor, and so on. And you see that in the middle. So this is a good cheat sheet. Again, you don't have to memorize, but you do want to get the gist, and you do want to also appreciate the fact that it's very significant that we here in the US don't have these federal privacy laws. It makes it much more difficult to have a consistent, uniform application of security that data subjects can just expect or to be guaranteed, right? Different industries require different amounts of data and have different requirements, different fines. So it would be much more in the interest of data subjects. And if we really do want to see changes made to information security, it would be worthwhile, it would be valid for us as a nation to look at adopting a federal standard like GDPR. All right, now, as we continue on talking about frameworks, the next framework I want to mention is the capability maturity model integration. This is certainly relevant. The CMMI came to us originally from the good folks at Carnegie Mellon in the Software Engineering Institute. And it was designed to indicate the reliability of an organization's project management processes in relation to software development. And it was designed as a way that the government could assess that reliability to get that third-party assurance. And the real focus here, anytime you hear this phrase maturity model, the idea is that the more mature an organization's process or processes, the better the product. So I can't inspect every piece of software that you put out, but if you can provide documentation of your processes, your procedures, your testing, your change control, all of those elements, and if I can look at those, I determine the maturity of those processes, and that gives an indication of the maturity of the product you'll produce. That's just kind of an upper level, the gist of what it is. So like I said, this was initiated with Carnegie Mellon, but ISACA now manages the capability maturity model integration. They've taken that over from Carnegie Mellon and SEI. So you know if it's another ISACA framework, that it's certainly possible that that would show up on the exam. All right, so originally designed for software development, but it's really shifted from just development to information security and other organizational processes. Now here's your commercial for the CMMI. I thought I'd throw that on there because again, it comes to us from ISACA. So what are their goals? You can see these goals. I'm not going to sell you the CMMI, but this is the mentality. I'd rather show you about how it works or what the idea is. Okay, so they have a suite of products that address 5 main domains or components that work together. And ultimately, what we look for with CMMI is we look to demonstrate a mature process. Now, there are 5 levels of maturity that are defined per the CMMI, starting at the very bottom, which is initial, all the way up to the top level of maturity, which is optimizing. I would know these 5 levels. I think that is one of those things that you need to memorize. I don't think they're going to, describe an environment and say, would this be level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? There are a couple of buzzwords at some of these, so I just want to, kind of cover them. So an organization that is just really kind of getting started, so to speak. I don't mean they're a brand new company, but I mean they're just moving towards having formalized framework and formalized processes in place, are likely going to receive a level 1 evaluation. They're going to be categorized as, in the initial level. And so you can see the words unpredictable and reactive. Usually when an organization is seeking CMMI level, they're probably not going for level 1. Right? Yay, we're unpredictable. That's not usually what we're seeking. Other words associated with level 1, chaotic, heroic efforts, meaning we might pull it off, but that means we're going to have folks working overtime and weekends and really just throwing everything they have at it. Now, level 2 is a step in the right direction. We have our projects that are planned, performed, measured, and controlled, meaning we have a well-defined scope on our projects. We have a schedule, we have a budget, and we measure up against our baseline configurations for each of those. We are able to make changes to our projects and our endeavors as we move forward according to a specific process. Now, defined, a lot of organizations are looking to get evaluated at the level 3. So we're proactive. We don't just respond, but we have proactive strategies in place. We have organization-wide standards. So regardless of the office or the location, we have standards across these programs, projects, portfolios, and they are defined. They are repeatable. Quantitatively managed means that we are data-driven. I understand quantitatively how a change to my process impacts the product that I'm producing. I have an alignment with stakeholder objectives. We're getting there. And then finally at the top, optimizing, continuous improvement. We're always looking for ways to perform the process better, to make a better product, to make us more efficient, whatever our goals and objectives are. So, as an organization, again, if my business objective is to, again, provide more customer confidence, then I might decide we're going to go out and get CMMI level 3. Or if I'm going to increase market share, if I'm going to do business with government agencies, a lot of agencies require that I'm CMMI level 3. So that might be a driver to say, hey, we're going to undertake this framework that, of course, comes with, like we mentioned, the products and the guidance from ISACA on how to implement this environment. Right? So there's always a reason that our governing entities choose specific frameworks. Always a reason. Okay, don't spend too much time memorizing the frameworks. Be able to tell me a 10,000-foot view of what each of those frameworks do. Why COVID? Why CMMI? Why GDPR? Right? So you don't have to get down into the nitty-gritty, but have the gist of what those frameworks do. Now, almost always, each organization that you're going to work with have external drivers for which framework they're going to choose and external drivers that are going to impact their security program and policies and procedures and so on. A lot of times, those external drivers are related to the law, and we want to stay within legal compliance. Now, I've got a question for you. I just want you to think about. Is there ever a time I might choose to be out of compliance with laws or regulations? And the answer is yes. When we look at regulatory requirements and we think about the possibility of being outside of those, we evaluate them as a risk like any other risk. There are some requirements or some regulations that we choose to be out of compliance with because the cost of compliance is greater than the cost of non-compliance. So it's not like regulations are always the trump card for every decision you make, right? Being out of compliance is another risk. We make a good business decision. Now, we have to consider all the repercussions and all the costs that are associated with that risk, right? So fines, um, and then if we're fined, does that become public information? Does that cause the our customers to lose confidence? We've got to look at things from a broad perspective, but I just want to stress that being in compliance is another consideration in the world of risk management. Now, when we think about compliance, there are all sorts of laws. But like I said, though there are no federal laws that specifically dictate a specific set of privacy controls for data, the laws and regulations tend to be directed at specific industries. We've got laws that address privacy, usually protecting data subjects' information, intellectual property that protects creations or protects what do I want to say? Protects whether it's ideas or products of the mind is probably a good way to think of intellectual property. We have contracts that we enter into with our business partners. And then, of course, always we want to be aware of civil, criminal, administrative laws. And that really is part of due care and due diligence, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Governance, our governing entities, governing bodies are accountable for us being in compliance. So at the end of the day, if we're not in compliance, then those fines, penalties, or even worse would be directed at our senior officers. Now, I did just want to mention two terms before I move over, and I wanted to mention the terms. I don't have them on the slide now that I think about it. I wanted to mention the terms due care and due diligence. And demonstrating due diligence and due care is part of what senior leadership is responsible for. So when we talk about due diligence, That means becoming knowledgeable. If I go out and let me give you an example. So let's say that I have some computers connected to the internet that get compromised by an attacker. And that attacker uses them to launch a downstream attack on another company, costing thousands of dollars worth of damage. Okay, so they're my computers, but I didn't have any ill intent. An attacker compromised them and used them. So the question then would be, am I liable? Maybe. If I were to then ask you, is it possible to secure a system in such a way that you can guarantee there would be no compromise? Can I do that? Can I really guarantee that I've built a system that cannot be compromised? Of course not. And as soon as you think you can, somebody's going to come around and compromise that system, right? So what can I do? I can do what's right. I can do what is industry standard. I can do what's recommended by consultants. I can make sure I'm in compliance with laws and regulations and best practices, right? So in short, I need to use due diligence and due care. Due diligence means that I take that information, I research. That's the part where I go find out what are laws and regulations, best practices, industry standards. I might conduct vulnerability assessments within my organization. Due diligence is the research. Due care means I act upon what I learn with due diligence. So due diligence is research, due care is action. So when we say information governance is accountable for compliance with laws and regulations, knowing what the laws and regulations are is due diligence. Making sure we're in compliance is due care. Okay, so that's another element that senior leadership is accountable for. Okay, now other considerations. Data retention. How long should I keep my data? How long should I keep email messages? How long should I keep patient information? How long should I keep process data? The answer is it depends. What does it depend on? Well, a lot of times it depends on what our policy is, but our policy is often driven by external drivers. Again, often laws and regulations. So certain industries are required to keep certain types of data for, 1 year, 7 years, whatever. Now, with that policy, we take those requirements, we look at stakeholder needs, and we determine what our archival policy should be. We don't want to keep data longer than we need to, right? The longer we keep data, the longer we have to protect it, the longer we're accountable for its security. It then becomes kind of a liability, right? So we keep data as long as we're required to do so, which should be determined in the writing of the policy. And at the end of the data lifecycle, at the end of its retention, then we destroy it. Secure destruction of data is important, making sure we don't just click the delete button, but that, if it's data that's sensitive of any sort of nature, maybe we overwrite the drive or we physically destroy the drive or we crypto shred, which means we encrypt it and then destroy the key. The bottom line is we retain data as long as we need to, usually based on laws and regulations. At the end of its retention period, we make sure the data is destroyed securely and that it's destroyed securely and consistently, regardless of where the data is located. So sometimes we may have multiple copies of data at different locations. At the end of the retention period, we destroy it across all of its locations, regardless of where the data is stored. We also, when we're storing data for a long time, we need to make sure that we're archiving that data to media that we can access later on. I don't know if, for those of you that have been around for a while, the various tape formats that we've had, or disk formats, or, just we want to make sure that if we're saving to a certain format of media, we're going to be able to access that type of media in 2 years or 5 years or at some point in time when we need it. So we just need to go back and evaluate. When I first was in IT, we were using the floppy disks, but then came the zip drives and the jazz disks and the various formats of uh, tape that we were backing up to. So that's less relevant for us, locally, because many of us are archiving to the cloud. So that becomes kind of the cloud service provider's responsibility. But we need to be aware of that and make sure that data can be retrieved at any point in time that's necessary. Now, as I mentioned, various ways of getting rid of data once it's exceeded its life cycle. We want to make sure that the data doesn't remain, that there are no remnants of data. So I've just listed out a few types here: clearing, purging. Physical destruction is obviously going to be the best way to ensure there are no data remnants, but that's not always realistic. We may need to reuse the media, or we may be storing this data in a cloud service provider. So that's not going to work either. Crypto shredding would be the more secure way um, to secure data in the cloud. And like I said, that was encrypting the data, destroying the key. Okay. Okay. Now, one of the things also with that might drive our retention policy would be that potentially information that we store may need to be accessed by law enforcement, may need to be presented in a court of law. So we refer to that idea as e-discovery. Often that impacts email, but again, other types of communications, electronic communications. So we need to make sure that our retention policy would be driven by laws and regulations revolving around e-discovery. Okay, physical considerations. Now, a lot of times as information security managers, the idea is, well, I'm not in charge of physical considerations. I'm not the person that chooses what building we operate out of, and I agree with that. However, it's important for us to understand that our physical environment is, of course, a critical aspect of the security of our information. So there are just a couple of little notes here in relation to physical security. And even though this may not be your role, it's important to kind of look for these elements. And if we have a voice within the organization, use that voice to make sure that our physical security doesn't provide a vulnerability in relation to our data. Now, there is a concept called CIPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And this really focuses in on physical security controls. And the idea behind CIPTED is that if you build a facility to be secure, it's easier than going back and securing an existing facility. This idea, secure by design, that's not just for physical security, right? That's software development, that's system development. That is, build something to be secure as opposed to building it and then going back and going, how do we secure this? Right? So things like having a building somewhere where there's natural surveillance, natural access control, prickly bushes under windows, that's a deterrent to an attacker. Territorial reinforcement, making sure that that the control and the access to that organization is well marked. And then maintenance and management, making sure that your building is kept up, that it doesn't look like it's abandoned, right? That the yard is mowed and or the grass is mowed and that um, there's a fresh coat of paint. Again, I don't expect these to be under your control, but as we move more towards the management and governance side, we begin to have a greater and greater voice. and making sure that we understand that physical security absolutely impacts our data security, and that these are just some guidelines on how we can um, create a secure environment from scratch. Okay. Some other considerations: temperature and humidity control. Temperature around 70 degrees, humidity around 50%. You don't want too much fluctuation in either. Uh, and what's been interesting is with temperature control, one of the things is I'm seeing organizations have their data centers, temperature has been increasing. And the idea is, after doing a careful thought, a cost benefit analysis, that it's cheaper to let processors burn up than it is to cool the entire data center. I don't mean just left and right let processors burn, but by increasing the temperature a couple of degrees, I get a whole lot of cost savings from uh, uh, air conditioning. And in evaluating the number of processors I lose, many organizations are determining it's more cost beneficial to let the temperature creep up a little bit. Okay? So all of these are risks that have to be evaluated independently. What are the trade-offs for security? What am I willing to trade off? What kind of return on investment do I get? What's the cost benefit analysis? It's what all of these considerations revolve around. All right, now, as we move past those ideas, the next thing our governing entities are responsible for is to develop an information security strategy. Well, our corporate strategy is essentially is going to direct us in how we accomplish our goals and objectives, right? How we satisfy the needs of stakeholders. So in our information security strategy, it's the same idea. It's that broad direction that we're headed in. I always think about security strategy with, I like to watch football. Sadly, I'm a fan of the Carolina Panthers. I don't want to hear about it in the chat. 1 year is going to be our year. Not this year, and probably not next year, but someday we're going to have a real year. But anyway, I think about at the end of the second half, at the end of the halftime, the coach comes out, and always there's a reporter that's out there on the field. So, what's your strategy for the second half of the game? And the coach will say, well, we're going to run the ball more. That's going to open up their passing lanes. We're going to, try to catch them off guard on defense. Those are really broad, sort of general ideas. That doesn't give away our playbook, right? But it does prioritize, it does sort of state, here's what we're going to do it, and generally speaking, how. So what happens is our stakeholders get that information, or our leaders take the stakeholder needs and requirements. They translate that into objectives and goals for the business, and then determine what the security strategy is. That'll kind of give us that broad picture of how to get there. Now, the strategy has to be in alignment with their business objectives. Again, that's always relevant. Our strategy has to look at risks and prioritize decisions based on risk. It's got to deliver value. The way we're doing this has to provide value to the organization. I don't know of any coach that's ever come out of the locker room and said, well, our strategy for the second half is to fumble more. We just need to fumble more, right? Or I think we're just not going to try very hard, right? There's no value. I've got to make choices, even though here in my strategy they're broad. I have to make sure that they're in alignment with where we want to go and that they're going to pay off, right? Tried and true value delivery. I've got to use my resources well. I don't say I'm going to have my quarterback run the ball every play and throw the ball and catch it himself. I'm not optimizing my resources. So the idea is these elements are true of strategy. And my organizational strategy and my information security strategy should possess these traits. What are we looking to do? Now, again, our information security program is going to give us the how. Governance is always telling us what. Big picture, this is what we're going to do. Our security program on Thursday tells us how. All right. Now, an alignment with our business objectives. Again, we've already talked about a framework, right? And we said, okay, I'm going to become ISO 27001 compliant or CMMI level 3 or whatever that may be. So, am I already there? Am I already compliant with ISO 27001? Probably not. So, I have to look at my current state. Where am I? Okay, well, we're here, we're not there, we don't have this, we do have that. We look at our current state. And then we have to look at our future state, sometimes referred to as a desired state. All right, so what are the things that need to be implemented? What are the elements that we have to demonstrate? And our roadmap is essentially, again, a broad instruction on how to close that gap, closing the gap between current state and future state, right? Current state and desired state. And our strategy should provide us a means of closing the gap. That's really what our security strategy is all about. Gap analysis. Where are we? Where do we want to be? What do we need to implement to close that gap? So you can associate our security strategy. You can associate the frameworks as providing us with the means to close the gap. So I think you could see several questions about the CMMI framework should be used for, and then the only answer often that makes sense, gap analysis. Where am I? Where do I need to be? What are the specific requirements that need to be satisfied to close that gap? Now, as we're developing our security strategy, as governance is, are we making good decisions for the organization? And an enemy to decision making is bias. And bias is when we make decisions or judgments based on something other than logical, rational thought. And it happens all the time. And everyone is subjected to bias. So the best way to deal with bias isn't pretending it doesn't exist, but it's acknowledging that it exists and confronting that bias and making good business decisions. Really critical as a manager to be aware of the fact that sometimes I'm overconfident. Sometimes I underestimate the time it will take to do things. Or this idea of groupthink or herding, that I tend to just take on the ideas of others. Or false consensus. I find people that think exactly the way I think, and I use that to prove my point. Well, of course I'm right. 10 of my closest friends agree with me, right? They're not going to ask you on the different types of bias. These are just some types of bias to kind of make it more real. Just the danger of bias and the fact that the way we confront bias is we surround ourselves with people that'll hold us accountable. We surround ourselves of people with different background and experience that are willing to challenge us. And we ourselves have the emotional intelligence enough to admit we might be biased, to tackle it head on, and to make good, rational decisions. That goes back to what we were talking about with governance. One of the first principles of governance is fairness, to make good decisions based on the facts. All right, we talked about gap analysis and using those frameworks for gap analysis, and the strategy, the information security strategy is going to close that gap. We look at where we are, maybe versus a framework that tells us where we need to be. Our strategy says, here's how we're going to get there. And again, that's the responsibility of governance. And then your roadmap is often a visual that kind of lends itself to communicating what your strategy is to others. And you can see this is just a, silly little graphic, but the idea, you see the broad points within the roadmap, not the details. That comes in our program. And our goal there is to close that gap. So this is going to be the basis for our program. And our security program, again, is the action, is where we take action to get these objectives. Okay? Or I can develop my strategy. I want to figure out, like I said, where we are. And many times that's going to require use SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So how we're going to approach closing the gap, we're going to maximize our strengths. We're going to minimize our weaknesses. We're going to try to take advantage of opportunities and minimize our threats. So often we do an assessment, a SWOT assessment, to determine what those are, because we want to make sure that that gap is that we're closing the gap in the way that we're most likely to be successful. Okay. And I think this is a good graphic that just what are the elements of SWOT that you have to consider. Other ways we make decisions as managers, project leaders, program leaders, managers, we could use a balanced scorecard or scorecard. And the idea is that benefit is not always just profit, right? Certainly, we like money, we like to profit, we like to see the financial benefit, and that's one area of evaluation on a balanced scorecard. But we also have to look at how it's going to impact our customers. Is it going to improve our customer confidence ratings? What are our internal processes? So when we talk about our internal processes, do we have the internal processes? How will they be? How will they benefit from the changes we're making? Are we going to operate more efficiently? Because that's certainly an incentive, or that's certainly tied to value. And then also, how can we increase our knowledge base? How can we allow our employees to develop, to learn from what we determine? Do we have that opportunity for growth? So a balanced scorecard is all about looking at value from different perspectives, from financial, from customers, from process, and from learning capabilities. And this is what a good project manager looks at to determine endeavors that they're going to undertake, but also, again, tied back into the strategy. Is our approach going to give us benefit, not just for profit, but maybe from internal perspectives, maybe from customer perspective, whatever that may be. Okay? And again, we look at those elements and we develop our roadmap. We determine what our target is, and then ultimately what the tasks are, prioritizing our methodology, setting this up as a project. So again, just another example of this just being a template, but an example for a roadmap that you might create to define or to communicate your security strategy with your team. All right, and then the last little bit here, talking about organizational culture. Just out of curiosity, just want to pause and just ask you to think about the culture, particularly the security culture of your organization. And I've worked in organizations that has a very security minded and focused culture. And I've worked in organizations that are very lax in their security culture, if you will. So the question being is, what's the difference? Like, who drives culture within an organization? So it's senior leadership. If you want to impact a change in organizational culture, that has to come from the top. And that's a really important idea on this exam, right? If I walk into your organization, I can get a feel for your culture within a minimum amount of time. And by understanding your company culture, I can pretty quickly figure out whether or not senior leadership in your governing entities, whether or not they have buy-in with security, because that flows downwards. So when I go into a company and multiple people are walking through the security door on one card swipe, or there's no security desk where visitors have to check in, or people walk away from their laptops with their access cards still in the reader or don't lock their systems, that's a real indication of the organizational culture. And ultimately, that gives me an indication of the commitment from senior leadership to security. So culture comes from a lot of different places. Leadership, though, has the greatest impact on culture. Now, we can change culture within the organization, but it's always so much easier to start with a security minded culture than it is to come into an organization and change that culture. But if that's our task, we can certainly, you know, implement initiatives, try to enhance working relationships between teams, but you're always going to have these variables with culture as well. But really, the main impact on culture does come from senior leadership. So, what we're looking for, information security culture, this first bullet point, I like this. Security awareness and behaviors are seamlessly integrated into employees' daily operations, as well as a strategic executive leadership priority. Now, I'm just going to pause. I just want you to think, is that the organization that you work in? Is security awareness, are employees' behaviors seemingly integrated with a focus on information security or security as a whole? And I think most people would say maybe in some places. I think other folks can kind of give a definitive yes. Some folks can give a definitive no. But I think the majority of folks would say maybe. Yes here, not so much here. We've got some room to grow. That's exactly where this gap analysis and security strategy come in. We know where we want to be. We want to check off these bullet points, these first and second bullet points. We want a security culture where we are aware. It's just what we do, it's how we make decisions. Well, that's not where we are. Well, where are we? Well, we do check IDs of visitors. We do these things. That's where we are. Where do we want to be? How do we close the gap? That's our strategy. And our information security strategy also is going to include how we communicate to the team, our expectations through policies and procedures. And then the enforcement of those policies and procedures also is going to impact culture. Mhm. We want employees to make good decisions. We don't want employees to be bound to a list of do this, don't do that. Because anytime there's ever a variation from that list, an employee say, well, you didn't tell me not to do it. We want employees to make good, sound decisions based on an understanding of security and of risk management. I'll never forget this. One of the first classes I taught way back in the 90s, actually, back in 95, I taught a class of nurses how to use Windows 95. We were coming from Windows 3.1, so that gives you a little bit of a date there, but it's mid 90s. And I spent the whole morning teaching the miracle of the right click and the double click and just the different patterns of using your mouse. And it was not a very advanced group. I mean, it took a while to get tap tap for double click. Back in the 90s, so many people didn't have big computer skills. Um, So it, again, not a profoundly computer savvy group, but at lunch, I was totally goofing off. And I went to eBay. I was going to eBay. I can't remember if I was buying something or selling something. Um, so at any rate, I was just goofing off. And I went to eBay and I got a message that the hospital's proxy had blocked my transaction or my connection. And I was like, I don't care. I'll just go at lunch or, just do it later. And ultimately, I wound up, one of the nurses passed by and she said, "Oh, Kelly, go here." She said, "Go to www.proxy7.com and type your request, and then you'll be able to connect." So here's someone that didn't know right click from left click, yet she knew well enough to send my request through an anonymizing proxy out on the internet so that I could go to a site her security team had blocked. Blew my mind. And the idea is she didn't think she was doing anything. She was following the rules, and there was no rule that said you shall not go to proxy7.com. So instead of just giving a set of rules in our security training, we want to help educate our users to understand the threats that exist, the vulnerabilities inherent to our line of work, and that we make good decisions that are thoughtful in alignment with our policies. And that's a lot different from just having a list of do this, don't do that. Mm. All right, just had a couple of quick questions about overlap between CISSP and CISM. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier. Risk management, information security, and the philosophy of the importance of policies and procedures, um, the alignment with business objectives, those are definitely overlaps. And then Abdul, how many sessions? There are 4 sessions, 1 session each day, somewhere around 3 to 4 hours, that will cover the 4 domains of the CISM certification. All right, now, last informational slide here. Best practices start with culture. Build a secure culture. Train your organization, your employees to focus on security. Again, not a list of things to do and not do, but how to think and how to make decisions that are risk aware. Understand the value of what we're protecting. Figure out what threats exist and the vulnerabilities that we allow. Poor behavior, weak passwords, unpatched systems, all those vulnerabilities that exist. Help them make good security decisions that find the right amount of security. Not overkill either, right? But the right amount of security. And we'll talk tomorrow about what is the right amount of security. And the right amount of security is a balance between protecting our assets and keeping the business moving, right? Meaning efficiency, ease of use, user acceptance, backwards compatibility. Tomorrow focuses on that balance. Now, also, like we said, getting senior leadership on board. Ideally, senior leadership's on board, right? That's not the case many times. So our job as security professionals to get the ear of those decision makers, whether it's the CEO, the CFO, whoever those parties are that can support our endeavors and helping to communicate our value. We'll talk a lot about value tomorrow. Okay, so my friends, these are the main elements from domain 1. Like I said, we have a total of 4 domains. We'll do 1 domain each day for a session of between 3 and 4 hours. So we are wrapping up domain 1. And what I wanted to do was to direct your attention to those topics, ideas, concepts that are most relevant under the CISM certification exam. Understand the concepts and the requirements for information security governance, why we need governance, what the role of our governing entities are, what their responsibilities. One of the big responsibilities, taking stakeholder needs, prioritizing them, and making sure that we have well-defined goals and objectives. Governance chooses a framework that will help us accomplish those objectives. If you're in the government, you may use NIST framework, cybersecurity framework. You may use CMMI or ISO 27000, but governance determines a framework that's integrated throughout the organizations. Make sure we're in legal compliance, or we address those risks based on the standard risk methodology that we choose. Again, we'll look at it tomorrow. Then we determine what our security strategy is. We analyze where we are versus where we want to be and figure out how to close that gap. And ultimately, we want to make sure that our culture supports the direction we're headed. Okay, now I have a question about being a data owner. I'm not 100% sure that I'm following the question from Stuart. What if people don't have the appetite for being a data owner? Would that be don't have the knowledge or understanding for being a data owner? Or I don't know if you might follow up that question, but just to reiterate, the data owner is accountable for the protection of data. They make the decisions on the right amount of security, and they do so in conjunction with the security team. As a member of the security team, I can advise, but the deciders are the data owners. So they have guidelines that they work within, right? And they have requirements that need to be met, but it's the ultimate responsibility of the data owner to ensure that their resources are protected. So they're responsible for evaluating, monitoring, and maintaining the security controls. That needs to be clearly defined. So the data owner doesn't just come out and say, this is top secret data or this is high value data. They have a data classification strategy that they can use for guidance. That classification strategy will say, okay, data owner, what criteria does your data meet? All right, then that is going to be categorized as medium, uh, uh, have a security category of medium security. And based on that security category, here are the security controls that you should choose to implement. So, I kind of went through that quickly saying, oh, the data owner's the decider. But what's so important and part of our security program that we'll look at on day 3, Thursday, what's so important and so necessary is that we have the policies and procedures in place so that data owners can make good choices and the appropriate security can be implemented. Okay, folks, we have indeed gone through the material of Domain 1. So my question to you, do you have any questions? Is there anything that I can answer for you or make a little more clear or anything I can help with? All right. So Domain 1, Information Security Governance. Not a really long chapter. That's appropriate because it's only 17% of the exam, right? So the other 3 chapters make up the vast majority. So this is a little bit shorter than some of the other chapters. It's important to understand concepts, 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 concepts. Why we need frameworks, why we do gap analysis, what the security strategy does, and how the roadmap illustrates it. How this governance sets out our goals and objectives, and then we're going to find a risk-based approach for how to accomplish those goals and objectives across the next 2 days. And then day 4, which is Friday, is going to tell us how we're going to address incidents or things with negative impacts on our environment. All right. So a question I often get is this enough for me to pass the exam? Well, of course it's not enough for you to pass an exam. In order to pass the exam, you got to take this information and study it, learn it, understand it. And one of the best ways to determine if you really have learned it and you really understand it, as well as teaching your mind to take this material and apply it, the best thing I recommend is to do some review questions, some exam prep. Like I said, Cybrary's Insider Pro will give you access to our exam prep database. There are other exam prep databases out there. I'm not going to tell you Cybrary is the only organization that has exam prep databases. So whatever, I would always recommend doing some practice review questions. Try to get through 100 or 200 questions before you take the exam. So we can all kind of sit and listen to a lecture and go, I get that. That makes sense. Okay. But what we want to be able to do is to make sure that we understand it in depth and can apply it. And the best way for that is to get your review questions. So, of course, I'm always going to say go with Cybrary. I think they have great material, great exam prep. But if you're not going to, make sure that you use some exam prep to kind of solidify what we know. Okay. And guys, got to tell you the truth. I know today was a little slow because it's frameworks and compliance. Tomorrow, I think is fantastic. I think it's something that everybody can benefit. So make sure you get your entire family gathered around the computer tomorrow because we're going to talk about risk management, including identifying risks, assessing risks, responding to risks, and then continuing to monitor for risk. If I were to force every employee to attend one module of CISM, beyond a doubt, it would be on risk management. If we started making good risk-aware business decisions, the world would be a better place. And if you elect me as president, I will make sure that happens. All right. So, guys, thank you for your attention. I'm so excited that you spent multiple hours of your day with me. Real quick question. I'm going to wrap it up, and that anybody that wants to stick around for a little question and answer, stay with me. But if you were here for the lecture and need to get on about your day, have a great day. I hope you come back tomorrow, and um, good luck with all your studies. So I did have a question about, the sad reality, and it is a reality that many organizations don't prioritize security within their organization. They don't put a lot of effort, time, energy. So the reality of that is that they're opening themselves up to liability, to loss, to all those bad things we know that can happen. But how do we change their minds? Well, sometimes you can't. So the first thing I had to learn is sometimes I'm speaking to deaf ears. I'm talking to deaf ears. And I have to tell you, I have left organizations because of that. If a company hires me and yet doesn't take any of my recommendations, they're not getting any value from having me as an employee, and I'm not getting any satisfaction from working there. I'm not telling everybody to quit their job, but I'm saying I want to work in a security aware organization. I want to work in an organization that values security, that cares about their assets and takes steps to protect them. The second thing is if I don't, I have to make my peace with that. I have to make sure that I'm not on any decisions as the person with the signature, if you know what I mean. So I can advise someone till they're blue in the face what the right thing to do is, but they can still choose to do differently. I just want their signature saying that they made these choices. Usually, when I have recommendations or I do a vulnerability assessment or recommendations for improvement in the environment, I'll often offer two or three solutions, two or three suggestions. Here's your top cost, here's your low cost, here's your middle. Sign on, or here's the option just to reject my solution altogether. I want leadership to sign that paper. I don't want it coming back to me a poor decision. The other thing that I can do is I can control my immediate environment. I can control my team, how we approach security, how I enforce, how I determine what's right, and how I enforce and create a secure culture within my environment. Maybe it's just my team, and I make my peace with that's what I can do. And then the other thing is I continue to try to get the ear of decision makers. And when I run an information security project, when I set out my goals and objectives, those goals and objectives should be business goals and objectives, not IT objectives. So I'm not looking to, I'm going to upgrade the existing infrastructure. Okay. My goal isn't anything other than to help the business. So the way I frame those goals on these projects, I'm going to reduce man hours lost due to outdated equipment. And I'm going to reduce those man hours lost by 10% within the first quarter. Again, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but what I'm trying to say is when we run these projects, our projects should have goals and objectives directly tied to benefits to the business. And so those goals and objectives need to have clearly defined value expectations. Those are the objectives of the controls, the objectives of the project. And when I have a successful project, I can go back and say, look at the value this project delivered. Not in terms of, oh, I upgraded to an ASA 5000, but that I have reduced man hours lost in the first quarter by 3% from last year based on incident response reports or whatever. So I could have just made that a very quick answer and said, talk to your senior leaders in relation to the business as opposed to tech threats. Talk to them about cost benefit. Talk to them about return on investment. Prove value to them. Right? That was a tremendous question. And that also is a question I think you'll see on the exam multiple ways it'll be phrased. But that idea is sometimes senior leadership doesn't get it. How can we help get them on board? And I love that question. Are there other questions? All right. Now, tomorrow, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, or you're like me, as soon as we close the room, you'll think, oh, why didn't I ask her this? Jot it down. I'm going to start off tomorrow with a quick review of today, and then I'll pause for any other questions that you have that might come up. So if you didn't get to ask your question today, no sweat. We'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay. Again, thank you all. It has been such a pleasure to get to spend a little bit of time with you, and I hope to see everybody back tomorrow for Risk Management 101. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Take care, all.